But, the question here is not was he any good? The question is, was he good enough to win both the Cy Young Award and the Most Valuable Player Award in the American League in 1992? And for that matter, we might as well ask whether any relief pitcher is dominant enough to earn both of those accolades at the same time. Well, let's take a look at this. We're going to start first with Eckersley's history. Eckersley started off his career with the Cleveland Indians in the mid-1970s. After a few good seasons, Dennis really made a name for himself in 1977 when he pitched this no-hitter against the California Angels. Eckersley was good enough that season to earn a trip to the All-Star game. And he had good enough stuff to strike out Steve Garvey. Pretty impressive for a 23-year-old. He just busted it by him inside. Now, you would think that the Cleveland Indians, of all things, would really want to hold on to a pitcher like this, but as you know, baseball front offices are not necessarily known for their logic. They're frequently run by people who are kind of dumb. And so Eckersley, the all-star, the player who pitched so well in '77, found himself with the Boston Red Sox in 1978, which of course was a very consequential year. Well, Eckersley had another excellent year in 1978 and pitched well down the stretch. While the hot Red Sox cooled off late that summer, Eckersley was one of their few consistent pitchers. Now, Dennis did occasionally have a problem with leaving pitches high and was vulnerable to long balls. But then again, there were also times where he made the hitters look absolutely foolish. Now, even though Eckersley won 20 games in 1978, the Red Sox still wound up just one game short. Now, Eckersley did have a good season again in 1979, but by the early 80s, he really started to falter. And of course, the Red Sox weren't doing much anyway. And then he found himself traded to the Cubs in May 1984. We tend to forget about details like this, but it's interesting to know that Eckersley was traded for Bill Buckner. Now, 1984 was another magical season, of course, and Eckersley had a lot to do with it. But then again, Dennis was still susceptible to giving up long home runs like this. And in the end, Dennis's habit of throwing out meatballs like this caused the Cubs' dream season to die early. Now, I don't know a lot of the details here, but I do know that Dennis Eckersley started to have drinking problems sometime around this time. I think that he may have had them before in the early 80s, but it seems that going to Chicago and playing a lot of day games made the problem worse. And after the disappointment of 1984, his ability to pitch for the Cubs really started to take a blow. Eckersley's body language just looks bad in this game from 1985, and his normally good control had started to falter. Now, this isn't to say that Eckersley had become a horrible pitcher, but he wasn't the pitcher he once was, and he was far from the pitcher that he would become. Well, Eckersley was traded to the Oakland Athletics right before the start of the 1987 season. Now, that move away from Chicago, away from all the day games and all of that, gave him a real new lease on life. He went through Alcoholics Anonymous and almost overnight turned into a dominating relief pitcher. So originally, Tony La Russa had Eckersley pitching middle relief, which might be surprising to you. And Eckersley was anything but overpowering at first.
The first batter against Eckersley, and a fair ball into the corner. This will be extra bases for Heath.
But within a few months, La Russa had decided to put Eckersley into the closer role. And that's when Eckersley started developing a reputation as an overpowering closer. And that's the Dennis Eckersley that we all know and love, right? That is the overpowering pitcher we remember from the late 80s and the early 90s. The guy who seemed like he would never give up a base runner, let alone a run. But there are some deeper questions to ask here. Now, the first one obviously is why in the world you'd give an MVP award to a relief pitcher, a guy who doesn't have good enough stuff to be the starter, right? Now, don't get me wrong, Eckersley was a fantastic pitcher in those years. But the thing is that Eckersley really only used 2 pitches as a reliever. As the Nyer James Guide to Pitchers reminds us, Eckersley really only had a sidearm fastball and a slider during his years as a closer. And now, those of you who play OOTP know full well that you're not going to get a great starting pitcher if he's only got 2 major league level pitches. Now, the truth about Eckersley is that he had like 4 or 5 pitches when he started, but when he moved over to that closer relief pitcher role, he got rid of a bunch of the pitches that weren't doing so well, right? A pitcher who's only got like 2 pitches winds up being much better for relief pitching because it's easier to play up your strengths and ignore your weaknesses. So, can you really say that a reliever should be the Cy Young Award winner, let alone the MVP? Now, you need to remember that Eckersley wasn't the first relief pitcher to ever win the Most Valuable Player award.
Fly ball left field, going back is Phillips on the warning track, and the Oakland A's take a...
That honor goes to Jim Constantine, whose great relief pitching in 1950 helped the Phillies win the pennant. And actually, for all the talk about getting a great reliever in clutch situations, Constantine didn't pitch all that well in September 1950. The sad truth is that the Phillies might have clinched earlier if it wasn't for Constantine's 2 blown saves and 2 losses down the stretch. But the thing is that Jim did appear in 74 games in 1950, and he did manage to save 22 of them. Without Constantine's veteran arm coming out of the bullpen, it's pretty clear that the Phillies would have really struggled to win the pennant. They struggled as it was. So if you're thinking about the most valuable player in the terms of like the one guy that the team absolutely had to have in order to win the pennant, I think you can understand his selection. Back in 1981, Raleigh Fingers of the Brewers won MVP honors. Of course, 1981 was that strange split season. It's understandable that you'd have a somewhat unusual most valuable player winner. And truth be told, 1981 was one of Raleigh's best seasons. So, for example, if you pay a lot of attention to WAR, to wins above replacement, you'd consider Fingers' 1981 season to be really, really good for a relief pitcher. He racked up 4.2 WAR that season despite the strike, and doing so in only 47 games, right? So the record, I believe, is Goose Gossage in 75 with the White Sox, who got like 8.7 WAR or something like that. But for a reliever, if you're like above the 4 WAR territory, it's a pretty good place to be. As far as Fingers is concerned, his next closest WAR performance was his 76 season with the Oakland Athletics. He had 3.8 WAR that season, but in 70 games. So he was doing better in 81 in a smaller number of games than he was in 1976 with more games. Anyway, there's no question about it. His best season was 1981. The next reliever to win MVP honors was Willie Hernandez in 1984, another closer who had a fantastic year. Hernandez also had a year that WAR likes. He racked up a 4.8 WAR. Anyway, in all 3 of those cases, you can make an argument that somebody else was more deserving, especially somebody else on that team that wound up in first place. But you've got to remember that these guys were the guys out there pitching in clutch moments, game after game. And, you know, as I've looked at this, it turns out that relievers who can get around that, say, like 4.5 or so level of WAR tend to be guys who wind up in this MVP type conversation, provided that they're on a winning team, of course. If you're like poor Goose Gossage in 75 with the White Sox, nobody pays attention to you. The thing is, though, that Dennis Eckersley in 1992 was just different. Well, in 1992, Dennis Eckersley put up a WAR of 2.9. Interestingly enough, that was the top score of Oakland's pitching staff. This is a staff that was nowhere near as strong as it had been in 1990. But in retrospect, it really seems that Mark McGwire was a more valuable player to the Athletics than Dennis Eckersley. Or, in other words, the guy who was named MVP of the league probably wasn't even the MVP of his own team. I do think he was likely the MVP of the pitching staff, right? And I'm not saying that he wasn't dominant to some extent, but I am saying that Eckersley's reputation that season was largely exaggerated by a single statistic, the save. Okay, take this game on April 25th in Minnesota, for example. So the Athletics are up by 4 in the bottom of the 8th. Oakland has a 4-run lead, but the Twins have 2 men on base with only 1 man out. Now, the save rules, which are pretty arbitrary, dictate that this is a save situation since the tying run is in the on-deck circle. So Eckersley gets Brian Harper to pop out to left field for the second out.
And it's Henderson making the running catch, trimming.
He then gets Randy Bush to hit a lazy fly ball to right field to get out of the inning.
A late start, but now he's there. And the Twins
And because of how save rules work, all he has to do now is complete the ball game, and he's got the save. So the fact that the A's scored again in the top of the ninth doesn't impact the save. The fact that Eckersley gave up a leadoff double to Gene Larkin in the bottom of the ninth doesn't impact the save.
With his delivery that I've seen him in years.
The fact that Chili Davis drove in a run to make it 8-4 doesn't mean anything.
Larkin around to score. Don't go away just yet. Greensboro open. Their last report.
All that matters is that Eckersley completed the game and that the Athletics got the win.
To Eckersley, and Oakland has evened this series.
So you can see what's wrong with that save stat, right? It's easy to hold your closer back to give him that magical save opportunity, and when he has the opportunity, your closer isn't really punished for pitching poorly just as long as you win the game. Now, if you go back to 1992 and see what people were talking about, you'll see sentiments like this from Thomas Boswell. Pitchers shouldn't win the MVP because they aren't everyday players. Eckersley did have some stats that looked impressive at the time. For example, the A's were 64-5 in games in which he appeared, which I guess is something. He also had an extremely high save percentage for whatever that's worth, but remember that we just saw how ridiculous that save stat actually is. And could you imagine this scenario if Eckersley had won the MVP but not won the Cy Young Award? Now, the thing is, I remember 1992 pretty well, right? I was 8 years old, and I can remember when this decision was made because of how controversial it was. I was driving around that November sometime with my dad, and I can remember listening to sports talk radio with him and listening to some guys on some call-in show that were just screaming and were really, really upset about the decision to give the MVP to Dennis Eckersley. I mean, there are some people out there who really, really care deeply about this stuff. Anyway, in the end, Eckersley won the award by a pretty wide margin. It was nowhere near as close as some people thought it might be. And in some ways, this seems to have been a decision by sports writers to somehow make up for Eckersley not winning the award in 1990 or 1989 or 1988. The truth is that Eckersley was dominant during those years, especially 1990, which was likely his best season. He had an ERA of 0.61 that year, though he only had 48 saves. And the 1990 Athletics are rightly remembered as one of the best teams of all time, despite being swept in the World Series. So, maybe you can think of the 1992 MVP award as some sort of like lifetime achievement award for Dennis Eckersley. Now, it is true that his 51 saves that season seems somewhat impressive until you start digging into the stats, that is. For me, though, it's really not all that meaningful. But anyway, there is a sort of scientific way to test this, right? And after all, this is a channel that's focused on baseball replays, right? So I went into good old Diamond Mine Baseball and installed the 1992 season disc. I traded Dennis Eckersley straight up for Mike Schooler of the Seattle Mariners. I also removed Schooler's injury record from the database to make things equal. I made sure to set the replay up to not limit bench playing time or to do any weird shenanigans. I also made sure to set up the manager profiles to force the computer to use these guys as closers for their new teams. Now, if you try to do this yourself, I've got to warn you, since I did this wrong a couple of times, you have to remember to go back into the team roster screen and actually activate these players for their teams. Diamond Mine Baseball is really frustrating when it comes to stuff like this, largely because there's not a computer general manager that can, manage the roster. I do think that it's much more accurate than OOTP when it comes to replays, but the roster management in the game is simply not good. Even if you do it by hand, it's a headache. So I went in and activated the players. Now, in theory, this means that the computer will be forced to use them in their assigned roles. And I replayed the season with the real-life transactions and lineups turned on. It took less than 2 minutes to finish the whole replay. Now, if Eckersley really were an integral part of this team, we would see Oakland do a lot worse and Seattle do a lot better, right? And there shouldn't really be any other difference otherwise. We're using like real-life lineups and transactions, and the only players that we exchanged are never actually in the starting lineup. Anyway, let's see what happens. So, as you can see, the American League West ended in a tie for first place between the Chicago White Sox and Minnesota Twins. Oakland was in fourth place, 13 games out. Seattle was in fifth, 24 games out. Meanwhile, the Cardinals, of all teams, won the NL East. Atlanta won the NL West, no surprise there, and the Blue Jays won the AL East, also no surprise. You know, I'll tell you guys the truth, every single time I do an auto replay like this, I really wish that I hadn't, because I look at it and I think this would have been a lot of fun to, play out by hand. Especially in this case with that tie in the AL West. I mean, this would have been like a legendary replay. Anyway, let's go take a closer look and see how our guys actually did. Mike Schooler, who really wasn't a great pitcher, wound up with 32 saves and a 3.43 ERA while playing for a better team. Left-handed batters feasted off of him, but he was a bit more stingy with righties. Eckersley, meanwhile, had a 1.86 ERA, better than in real life, but only 40 saves. His situational stats are also pretty impressive when you think about it. So, in the end, the Mariners improved by 8 games over real life. The Athletics were worse by 13 games. So that does tell us that Eckersley, at least theoretically, made a difference, right? But does this mean that Eckersley's presence made a difference of about 10 games? Of course, not necessarily, right? There's a lot of randomness that's going on here as well, even as we try to hold things like transactions and injuries the same. And technically speaking, I probably should be doing like 100 or so of these replays and like averaging out the results to give something that's really statistically valid. That's really boring. I'm not going to bore you with all this. I'm not going to bore myself with all of this, even though it's only like 2 minutes to do one of these replays. We're just going to kind of go with this. Anyway, it's clear to me that Eckersley was a very good closer, sure. But remember that Mike Schooler still had over 30 saves in that replay, largely because of the team he played for. So if Schooler plays for the Athletics, maybe he winds up with a special Fleer Ultra subset in 1993. Now, the most interesting thing about Dennis Eckersley in 1992 is not just the fact that he won the Cy Young Award and the MVP in the same season, or the fact that it was kind of controversial. Truth is, at the time, it wasn't, right? He got an overwhelming number of first-place votes. It wasn't because the other competitors split the vote. Interesting stuff. Now, the most interesting part about Eckersley is what happened to him in the postseason. And this is the part of the story that everybody forgets. In the bottom of the 8th inning of Game 1 of the 1992 ALCS, John Olerud hit this single over Jeff Russell's pitching hand to tie the game at 3. Jack Morris, yep, that Jack Morris, then gave up a leadoff home run to Harold Baines in the top of the 9th that put Oakland up 4-3. With 2 men out, and while Dick Stockton was talking about Kirk Gibson in 1988, Ed Sprague hit a single to center field. Eckersley then got Devon White to hit this pop fly to end the game, and he looked like the MVP. But of course, that wasn't the whole series, not by a long shot. And this is where some of these managerial decisions start to look a little bit strange. The Blue Jays won the second game 3-1 thanks to a save by Tom Henke, their closer. Now in Game 3, down 6-5 with a man on first in the top of the 9th, Rick Honeycutt got the second out. The Athletics decided to put Eckersley in here despite the fact that it was clearly not a safe situation. Eckersley proceeded to give up a base hit to Joe Carter. And then Dave Winfield hit this ball off of Eckersley's legs, allowing a run to score and making it a 7-5 game. Though Eckersley got out of the inning, the Athletics went down in order in the bottom of the 9th, and the Blue Jays had a 2-1 series lead. So the big question here is, was it a good idea to use Dennis Eckersley in this situation? Well, maybe it was, but then again, maybe it wasn't, right? So Rick Honeycutt was a lefty, Eckersley was a righty. The right-handed hitting Carter really feasted off of lefties in 1992, so I understand why you would take him out. But the question is, like, why use your closer in this situation? Now, it's also true that Dave Winfield was a righty. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe Dennis Eckersley just had bad luck. The truth is, in 1992, that he was dominant against righties in the very few innings that he pitched. Well, Eckersley came into the top of the 8th of Game 4 with 2 men on and nobody out, leading 6-2, one of those magical save situations. And this time it was John Olerud getting the base hit to score a run, making it 6-3. Then Candy Maldonado also swung at the first pitch, driving in another run, making it 6-4. Now, this kind of gives you an idea of the fact that this magical closer stuff probably isn't a real thing, right? So the one thing that closers tend to have on their side is the small sample size. You only have to pitch to a couple of batters per appearance after all. This is why they can get away with having like only 2 pitches in their arsenal and basically kind of build up a whole bunch of like myth and mystique around themselves to make the hitters afraid. So when you let the guys that you're against see your stuff a lot, the magic kind of fades away. Well, Eckersley did get out of that inning without giving up any more runs. But then in the top of the 9th, with the score still tied 6-4, Eckersley gave up this single to Devon White, which turned into a lot more after Ricky Henderson made an error trying to make the catch.
Pitches he doesn't even flinch on, and they're trying to trick him.
And then Roberto Alomar hit this home run to tie the ball game, and the spell had been broken. Despite getting 2 outs, Eckersley gave up yet another single to John Olerud, and that was it for the Master. This sacrifice fly by Pat Borders in the top of the 11th gave Toronto a 7-6 lead.
The throw is not cut off, and the run. If he can dispose of Mark McGuire, he's ahead on the count 0-2.
And in the bottom of the 11th, with a runner on, Tom Henke got Mark McGuire to pop up to center field, ending the game. So sure, you win some and you lose some, but the closer role is supposed to be for these pressure situations, right? Remember, this is the MVP. This is Dennis Eckersley. This is the guy who was so good that he got his own Fleer Ultra subset in 1993. The great closer had failed twice in the clutch where it made the most difference.
Not a big lead.
Oakland crushed the Blue Jays in Game 5, putting up an easy 6-2 victory. But in Game 6, Joe Carter hit this monster first-inning home run, and Toronto never looked back. Oakland was never close. Toronto won 9-2, and Eckersley never got another chance. Well, and there you have it. So the Cy Young Award winner, the most valuable player in the American League, the legendary closer, in the end, he became the GOAT. This is back when GOAT means a bad thing, not a good thing like it does today. Whatever, you understand. Anyway, I guess this goes to show you how precarious the idea of that great closer really is. You're a hero one day and you're a bum the next. That's what Babe Ruth is alleged to have said. I don't know if he actually said it or not. But the question here is, should Dennis Eckersley have been the MVP in 1992? Like, does his performance in the postseason kind of give you a hint as to what his performance really was like? Or maybe did he get hurt by that ball that was hit off of his leg by Dave Winfield? I don't know. Like, let me know what you think.